The summer ballroom of Ravenscross Hall glittered like a jewel box that evening, every candelabra ablaze, every mirror reflecting the cream of English society in their finest silks and jewels. But Eleanor Ashford Thornhill, Duchess of Ravenscross, felt none of the warmth that such magnificence should inspire. She stood at the edge of the grand hall, her gloved hands clasped before her with a composure that had been practiced over 3 long years of silent endurance. The music swelled, the dancers twirled, and the laughter of the aristocracy filled the air with a lightness that seemed to mock the heaviness in her chest. For 3 years, she had held the title of Duchess, and for 3 years she had lived under the weight of a single, unspoken expectation that had slowly transformed from hope into judgment, from judgment into condemnation. She had failed to provide an heir. The whispers had begun as gentle murmurs in the first year, evolved into pointed glances in the second, and now, in this 3rd summer of her marriage, they had crystallized into something far more dangerous, a public consensus that a duchess without heirs was, in fact, nothing at all. Lady Constance Waverley, resplendent in emerald silk that matched the cold calculation in her eyes, held court near the refreshment table, surrounded by a circle of society's most influential matrons. Eleanor could feel their gazes like pinpricks across the distance of the ballroom, could see the way Lady Constance's fan moved with deliberate slowness as she leaned close to whisper something that made the other women's eyes widen with scandalized delight. Eleanor knew with the terrible certainty that comes from months of social torture that she was the subject of their conversation. She was always the subject, the Baron Duchess, the failed wife, the woman who had married the most powerful duke in England and could not fulfill the one duty that mattered. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against each other, the only outward sign of the storm that raged within her. She had tried everything, every prayer, every remedy, every hope, and still her body had betrayed her. Or perhaps, she thought in her darkest moments, she had simply been wrong for this role from the beginning, a girl from a respectable but unremarkable family, thrust into a world where bloodlines and legacy were everything, where her worth was measured not in kindness or intelligence, or the careful way she had learned to manage an estate, but in her ability to produce a son. The Duke himself stood across the ballroom, a figure of such commanding presence that even in a room full of nobility, he drew the eye like a lodestone. Alistair Thornhill, 6th Duke of Ravenscross, was a man carved from granite and duty, his handsome features set in an expression of perpetual distance that had only deepened since their wedding day. He spoke with a cluster of parliamentary lords, his posture perfect, his attention seemingly absolute, and yet Eleanor had learned to read the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when Lord Pemberton mentioned something about succession. He was a man haunted, she had come to understand, though by what ghosts she could only guess. In 3 years of marriage he had never once opened the door to his inner world, never shared the grief she knew he carried from his first wife's death, never looked at Eleanor with anything warmer than polite courtesy. They inhabited the same grand house, bore the same illustrious name, and yet they were strangers bound by contract and expectation, 2 people drowning in separate oceans of silence. It was then that Lady Constance made her move, gliding across the ballroom floor with the confidence of a woman who knew she held a blade and intended to use it. The crowd seemed to part instinctively before her, sensing drama the way sharks sense blood in water. She positioned herself in the very center of the ballroom, near enough to the Duke that he could not help but hear, near enough to Eleanor that the humiliation would be complete, and in a voice that carried with crystalline clarity across the suddenly hushed assembly, she spoke the words that would change everything. She questioned, with false concern dripping from every syllable, whether it might not be kinder to all parties involved if the Duke considered the possibility of an annulment, given the unfortunate circumstances that had left the great Ravenscross line without an heir after 3 full years of marriage. The ballroom fell into a silence so complete that the guttering of candles seemed loud. Every eye turned first to Eleanor, watching for her humiliation, and then to the Duke, waiting for his response. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, felt the room tilt slightly as if the very floor had shifted beneath her feet. This was it then, the moment she had dreaded, the public condemnation she had felt creeping closer with each passing month. Lady Constance had simply given voice to what everyone else had been thinking, had dragged Eleanor's failure into the merciless light of public scrutiny, where it could no longer be ignored or politely overlooked. She wanted to run, wanted to flee this glittering cage of judgment and never return, but her body would not obey. She stood frozen, a butterfly pinned to a board, waiting for the Duke to deliver the final blow, to agree with the assessment that a Duchess without heirs was indeed nothing, that their marriage had been a failure, that she had been a disappointment from the start. Her eyes found his across the expanse of polished marble, and for one terrible, infinite moment, she saw her entire future hanging in the balance of whatever words he would speak next. But Alistair Thornhill did not speak the words anyone expected. Instead, something shifted in his face, some wall that had stood firm for years, suddenly crumbling under the weight of a truth he could no longer contain. He moved, cutting through the crowd with a purposefulness that made even the most jaded aristocrat step back, and he walked directly to Eleanor, with his eyes locked on hers alone, as if the hundreds of people watching them had simply ceased to exist. He reached her side, and then, in a gesture that sent a collective gasp through the assembled nobility, he took her hand in his touch warm and solid and utterly unexpected, and he turned to face the crowd with Eleanor at his side, claiming her publicly in a way he never had before, preparing to speak words that would either save her or destroy them both. 3 years earlier, Eleanor Ashford had stood in the drawing room of her family's modest London townhouse, her hands trembling slightly as she held the marriage contract that would change her life forever. She had been 21 years old, the eldest daughter of a country gentleman whose fortunes had declined steadily over the past decade, and she had understood with painful clarity what this offer represented. The Duke of Ravenscross, recently widowed and in need of a wife who would ask no questions and expect no affection, had chosen her precisely because she was unremarkable. She brought no scandalous relations, no political complications, no romantic expectations that might complicate what was at its heart a transaction. Her father had explained it with awkward kindness. The Duke needed a Duchess, someone to manage his household and eventually provide an heir, and in return, the Ashford family would be elevated beyond anything they could have hoped for. Eleanor had signed her name with a steady hand, telling herself that many marriages began with less, that affection could grow with time, that she would make herself indispensable through competence and grace, if not through love. The wedding had been a grand affair, befitting a duke's marriage, yet Eleanor remembered it as a blur of unfamiliar faces and overwhelming ritual. Alistair had been courteous but distant throughout the ceremony, his vows spoken with perfect diction and absolutely no warmth. She had searched his face during those moments, hoping to find some hint of the man beneath the title, but his grey eyes had remained shuttered, focused on some distant point beyond her shoulder. That night he had come to her chambers and fulfilled his duty with mechanical efficiency, neither cruel nor kind, simply absent in any way that mattered. And then he had retreated to his own wing of the vast Ravenscross estate, establishing a pattern that would define their marriage: proximity without intimacy, cohabitation without connection. Eleanor had told herself that this was normal for aristocratic marriages, that she should not have expected anything different, but in her quietest moments, she grieved for the companionship she would never have, the partnership that existed only on paper. She had thrown herself into her duties with a determination that surprised even the most skeptical members of the household staff. Ravenscross Hall had been neglected during the Duke's period of mourning, the great house falling into a kind of beautiful decay that spoke of a master who could not bear to care about anything anymore. Eleanor had seen it as her mission to restore what had been lost, not just the physical grandeur of the estate, but something more intangible, the sense that Ravenscross was a home and not merely a monument to grief. She had spent months learning every detail of the household's operation, had met personally with every tenant farmer on the Duke's extensive lands, had reorganized the charitable works that the previous Duchess had established. The servants had been skeptical at first, measuring her against the beloved first Duchess, but gradually they had come to respect her quiet competence, her genuine kindness, the way she remembered the names of their children and asked after their troubles. But none of that mattered to the society that judged her worth by a single measure. The first year passed without a child, and Eleanor told herself it was simply a matter of time. The second year brought whispers and barely concealed speculation, and Eleanor began to feel the weight of expectation like a physical burden. The Duke's visits to her chambers became less frequent, his manner even more distant, as if her failure to conceive was somehow contagious. She had consulted doctors discreetly, had followed every piece of advice no matter how uncomfortable or humiliating, had prayed until her knees ached from kneeling. And still, month after month, her body remained stubbornly, devastatingly empty. She began to see the pity in the servants' eyes, the calculation in the eyes of the Visconde Edmund, who stood to inherit if she failed, the barely concealed contempt in the eyes of women like Lady Constance, who had always resented her elevation to a position they felt should have gone to someone more worthy. By the third year, Eleanor had almost begun to believe what they whispered about her. Perhaps she was insufficient, perhaps her blood was too common to mix successfully with the ancient Thornhill line. Perhaps she was being punished for the sin of marrying above her station. She had learned to move through society with a mask of serene dignity that hid the desperate fear beneath, had perfected the art of changing the subject when conversations turned to nurseries and heirs, had taught herself not to flinch when other young duchesses showed off their swelling bellies or cooed over their infants. She had made herself small and quiet and unobtrusive, hoping that if she asked for nothing, expected nothing, perhaps they would judge her less harshly. But that strategy had failed spectacularly, had only emboldened her critics to speak more freely, to suggest more openly that a duchess who could not provide an heir was a duchess who should be replaced. And now, standing in that ballroom with all of society watching, Eleanor understood that her time had finally run out. The months leading up to that fateful summer ball had been a slow descent into a particular kind of torture that only high society could devise. Eleanor had learned to read the language of fans and glances, the subtle shifts in conversation when she entered a room, the way invitations that had once arrived regularly began to dwindle. Lady Constance had appointed herself the unofficial spokesperson for those who believed Eleanor's position had become untenable, hosting intimate gatherings where the subject of the Duke's lack of an heir was discussed with increasing boldness. The Visconde Edmund, who had always treated Eleanor with cold politeness, had begun to appear more frequently at Ravenscross Hall, ostensibly to discuss estate matters with his cousin the Duke, but Eleanor knew he was circling like a vulture, waiting for the moment when her failure would become his opportunity. She had overheard him once, speaking to Alistair in the library, suggesting that perhaps it was time to consider the family's future, to think practically about the succession, and though she had not heard the Duke's response, the very fact that such a conversation could occur had left her feeling hollow. What made the isolation more unbearable was the Duke's continued distance. Alistair moved through Ravenscross Hall like a ghost in his own home, present but never truly there, occupying the same physical space as Eleanor, but existing in an entirely different emotional realm. They took meals together occasionally, observed by servants who maintained the fiction that theirs was a normal marriage, but the silence between them had grown so profound that even polite conversation felt like an intrusion. Eleanor had stopped trying to reach him after the first year, had learned that her attempts at connection only seemed to make him retreat further into whatever fortress he had built around his heart. She told herself that his coldness was not personal, that he was still mourning his first wife, that grief had simply made him incapable of forming new attachments. But knowing the reason for his distance did not make it hurt any less, did not ease the loneliness of lying awake at night in her enormous bed, knowing he was somewhere in another wing of the house, as unreachable as if he were on another continent. Yet despite everything, Eleanor had found small rebellions, tiny acts of defiance against the role society insisted she play. She had continued her work with the estate's tenants, had expanded the charitable programs, even when Lady Constance suggested such activities were unseemly for someone in her uncertain position. She had transformed the neglected rose gardens at Ravenscross, spending hours with her hands in the soil, coaxing beauty from what had been allowed to run wild. The head gardener, an elderly man named Thomas who had served the Thornhill family for 40 years, had told her once that she had her grandmother's touch with growing things, that the gardens had not looked so alive since the old Duke's time. It was a small compliment, but Eleanor had treasured it, had held on to it during the darkest moments when she questioned whether she had any value at all. The gardens became her sanctuary, the one place where her worth was not measured by her womb, but by her patience, her care, her ability to nurture life, even when her own body seemed determined to deny her that gift. The Duke had noticed the gardens, though he had never commented directly to her. She had seen him sometimes, standing at the window of his study, looking out over the restored rose beds with an expression she could not quite read. Once she had found a book on rose cultivation left on the table in the morning room, where she took her breakfast, a beautiful leather-bound volume that could only have come from his private library. He had not included a note, had not acknowledged the gift in any way, but Eleanor had understood it as a form of communication from a man who seemed incapable of speaking his feelings aloud. It had given her hope, fragile and foolish as that hope might be, that perhaps he saw her efforts, perhaps he recognized that she was trying to build something meaningful, even in the absence of the heir everyone demanded. But that hope had been crushed repeatedly by his continued silence, by his failure to defend her when the whispers grew louder, by his apparent willingness to let her twist in the wind of society's judgment without offering her even the minimal protection of his public support. By the time the summer ball arrived, Eleanor had resigned herself to her fate. She had packed a small trunk, hidden in the back of her wardrobe, filled with the few personal possessions that had meaning to her. Her mother's letters, a pressed rose from the garden, the book the Duke had given her. She had written a letter to her family, trying to explain what she could not fully understand herself, preparing them for the scandal that would surely follow an annulment. She had even begun to imagine what her life might look like afterward, a return to obscurity and modest circumstances, forever marked as the Duchess who had failed. She had walked into that ballroom expecting it to be her last appearance in society, her final performance in a role she had never truly mastered. What she had not expected, what she could never have imagined, was that the Duke himself might finally choose to speak, to act, to step out of his fortress of grief and duty and do something that defied every expectation she had learned to accept. The moment Alistair took Eleanor's hand in front of the entire assembly, something fundamental shifted in the air of the ballroom. His touch was warm and solid, so different from the perfunctory contact of their rare encounters, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. He did not speak immediately to the crowd, did not rush to fill the expectant silence with explanations or justifications. Instead, he looked down at her with an intensity she had never seen in his eyes before. Grey depths that had always seemed shuttered suddenly open and raw, with an emotion she could not name. For 3 years she had existed beside this man as a stranger, and now in the midst of her greatest humiliation, he was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. His thumb moved almost imperceptibly against her gloved hand, a tiny gesture of comfort or perhaps solidarity, and Eleanor felt tears threaten behind her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to give Lady Constance and her circle the satisfaction of seeing her weep. But the kindness in that small touch undid something in her chest that all the cruelty of the past months had not managed to break. Then Alistair turned to address the room, and his voice when he spoke carried a weight of authority that silenced even the most brazen whispers. He did not release Eleanor's hand, but rather drew her closer to his side, a public claiming that sent a ripple of shock through the assembled nobility. He spoke of his first wife, something he had never done publicly, acknowledging the grief that had consumed him, the way he had retreated into duty and distance because he had been unable to bear the thought of opening his heart again, only to lose what he loved. His words were measured but laden with emotion that years of aristocratic training could not fully conceal. He explained that he had married Eleanor, believing he could maintain that distance, that he could fulfill his obligations without risking his heart, but that she had proven him wrong in ways he had not anticipated. The ballroom was absolutely silent now, hundreds of people holding their breath as the most powerful duke in England revealed vulnerabilities that men of his station simply did not acknowledge. What came next transformed Eleanor's understanding of everything that had passed between them. Alistair spoke of the changes she had made at Ravenscross, not with the dismissive tolerance she had expected, but with genuine appreciation that bordered on reverence. He described returning from London after weeks of parliamentary business to find the gardens restored, to smell roses blooming where there had been only thorns and neglect, to see light and life returning to a house that had felt like a mausoleum. He spoke of watching her work with the tenants, defending their interests when his steward recommended harsh measures, showing a compassion that had shamed him into remembering what leadership truly meant. He admitted that he had been a coward, that he had hidden behind his grief and his duty, rather than acknowledge what was growing in his heart, that he had let her face society's judgment alone because he had been too afraid to admit how much she had come to mean to him. Every word was a revelation, a key unlocking doors Eleanor had not known existed, showing her that her 3 years of silent service had not gone unseen, that her worth had been recognized, even if it had never been acknowledged. Then Alistair addressed the matter that had brought them to this moment, and his words carried an edge of barely controlled fury directed at those who had dared to reduce his wife to a single function. He stated with absolute clarity that Eleanor's value had never resided in her ability to produce an heir, that she had transformed his estate, his household, and yes, himself in ways that mattered far more than bloodlines or succession. He declared that she had given him back his humanity when he had thought it lost forever, that she had shown him it was possible to live again rather than merely exist. He spoke of legacy, not as something carried in blood, but as something built through character and action, through the restoration of beauty and the practice of kindness, through the quiet revolution of a woman who had taken a house of mourning and made it a home. His voice rang through the ballroom with conviction that left no room for argument, and Eleanor felt something breaking open inside her chest, years of doubt and self-condemnation crumbling under the weight of his words. But it was what Alistair said next that would be remembered and repeated in drawing rooms across England for years to come. He turned to look at Eleanor again, his hand tightening around hers, and he told the assembled nobility that if they could not see her worth, then the failure was theirs and not hers. He announced that Eleanor was his choice, had always been his choice even when he had been too damaged to acknowledge it, and that she would remain his Duchess regardless of heirs or society's expectations. He stated that she was his legacy, the living proof that broken things could be mended, that grace and patience could accomplish what force and demand never could. The simplicity of his declaration carried more power than any elaborate speech could have managed. He had chosen her publicly and irrevocably, and in doing so had transformed her from the invisible, judged, insufficient woman she had believed herself to be into something else entirely, a duchess who was valued not for what she could produce, but for who she was. The impact of Alistair's words rippled through the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water, each ring of shock spreading outward until it touched every corner of the assembly. Eleanor stood frozen beside him, her hand still clasped in his, trying to reconcile the man who was speaking these intimate truths before hundreds of witnesses with the distant stranger she had lived beside for 3 years. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force that she wondered if he could feel it, wondered if everyone could see the way her carefully constructed composure was threatening to shatter under the weight of emotions she had taught herself not to feel. She had armored herself against cruelty, had built walls against disappointment, but she had no defense whatsoever against this unexpected tenderness, this public declaration that rewrote the entire narrative of their marriage. The tears she had been fighting finally escaped, sliding down her cheeks despite her best efforts, but she found she no longer cared who saw them. These were not tears of humiliation, but of something far more dangerous: hope. Lady Constance stood across the ballroom, her face a study in barely suppressed fury, the fan in her hand snapping closed with enough force to be heard even at a distance. She had orchestrated this moment expecting triumph, expecting to see Eleanor cast aside, and her own influence over the Duke's future choices secured, but instead she had been made to look petty and cruel before the very society she sought to dominate. The other matrons who had joined in the whisper campaign seemed to shrink back, suddenly finding their slippers or their fans extraordinarily interesting, distancing themselves from a battle they had clearly lost. Even the Vicomte Edmund, who had been standing near the Duke's parliamentary associates with barely concealed anticipation, now wore an expression of shock mixed with something that looked remarkably like respect. The power dynamics of the room had shifted in an instant, and everyone present understood that to challenge the Duke's declaration would be to risk his considerable wrath. Eleanor, who had been the object of pity and scorn just moments before, suddenly found herself protected by the most impenetrable shield available in English society, the Duke of Ravenscross's explicit and public favour. But it was not the crowd's reaction that mattered most to Eleanor in that moment. It was the way Alistair was looking at her, as if he were memorising her face, as if he were trying to communicate through his eyes what years of silence had prevented him from saying. She saw regret there, deep and genuine, for the loneliness he had forced upon them both. She saw vulnerability that must have cost him dearly to reveal, this man who had been raised to show no weakness, to maintain perfect aristocratic control at all times. And beneath it all, she saw something that made her breath catch in wonder. The tentative beginnings of love, or at least the recognition that love might be possible if they could find the courage to reach for it. He had not just defended her. He had opened a door between them that had been locked since their wedding day, had offered her a glimpse of the man he kept hidden beneath layers of duty and grief. The question now was whether she had the strength to walk through that door, to risk hoping for a real marriage when she had finally learned to survive without one. The orchestra, sensing that the moment of high drama had passed and that the ball must somehow continue, struck up a waltz with perhaps more enthusiasm than skill. Couples began to move uncertainly toward the dance floor, unsure whether it was appropriate to proceed with festivities after such an unprecedented scene, looking to the Duke for guidance. Alistair seemed to make a decision, his jaw setting with determination that Eleanor recognized from the rare times she had seen him at his most resolved. Without releasing her hand, without breaking eye contact, he led her onto the dance floor with a purposefulness that suggested this was not merely a dance, but a continuation of his public declaration. The crowd parted before them, with a deference that felt different now, no longer the cold courtesy afforded to a failing Duchess, but something warmer, more genuine. Eleanor allowed herself to be guided, her body moving automatically through the familiar steps of the waltz, while her mind struggled to process the transformation of her entire world in the span of mere minutes. As they began to move together to the music, Alistair finally spoke to her directly, his voice low enough that only she could hear beneath the swell of violins and cellos. He apologized, simply and without elaborate justification, for the loneliness he had caused her, for the silence he had imposed, for the failure to see what had been before him all along. He told her that he had been watching her far more than she knew, that he had seen her in the gardens and with the tenants, that he had read every report from the steward about her improvements to the estate with a growing sense of awe he had not known how to express. He confessed that he had been terrified, that after losing his first wife so tragically, he had convinced himself that distance was the same as safety, that if he never allowed himself to care, then he could never be destroyed by loss again. But Eleanor had slowly, inexorably broken through those defenses without even trying, simply by being exactly who she was, patient, kind, resilient, and utterly unaware of her own extraordinary worth. His words meant only for her ears, completed what his public declaration had begun, offering her not just vindication before society, but the infinitely more precious gift of genuine connection with the man she had married. Eleanor's response came not in words, but in the way her hand tightened in his, in the subtle softening of her posture as they moved together across the polished floor. For 3 years she had maintained perfect deportment in his presence, always conscious of being observed and judged, always performing the role of Duchess rather than simply existing as Eleanor. But now, in this moment of unexpected intimacy, despite the hundreds of eyes watching them, she allowed herself to be vulnerable in return. She let him see the pain his distance had caused, the nights she had lain awake wondering what flaw in herself had made her unworthy of even basic companionship. She let him see the strength it had required to continue, day after day, in the face of his indifference and society's condemnation. But she also let him see forgiveness, tentative and fragile but real, because she understood now what she had not understood before, that his silence had been a prison for him as much as it had been a punishment for her, that they had both been suffering alone when they might have suffered together and found comfort in shared struggle. The waltz continued, and with each turn around the ballroom, Eleanor became increasingly aware of the stares, the whispers that had changed in character, if not in volume. Where before the speculation had been about her inadequacy and imminent dismissal, now it concerned itself with this unexpected display of ducal devotion, this public claiming that defied every expectation. She could see Lady Constance watching from the sidelines with an expression of such concentrated venom that Eleanor almost pitied her, almost felt sorry for a woman whose power had been built entirely on the manipulation of others' insecurities and who now found herself suddenly irrelevant. The other young wives and mothers who had looked at Eleanor with condescension now regarded her with something closer to envy, perhaps realizing that affection freely given might be worth more than heirs mechanically produced. The shift in social dynamics was palpable, a complete inversion of the hierarchy that had governed Eleanor's experience of aristocratic life, and she found herself simultaneously exhilarated and terrified by how quickly everything could change. Alistair seemed to sense her disquiet, the way her breathing had become slightly uneven, the tension that had crept back into her shoulders despite the intimacy of their conversation. He adjusted his hold on her waist, pulling her incrementally closer in a way that would have been scandalous had they not been married, grounding her with his physical presence. He told her, his voice still pitched for her ears alone, that he knew words could not undo 3 years of neglect, that he had no right to expect her forgiveness or her trust after failing her so thoroughly. But he wanted her to know that his declaration tonight was not merely for show, not a performance designed to save face before society. He meant every word he had spoken. He had finally acknowledged to himself what his heart had been trying to tell him for months, that Eleanor had become essential to him in ways he had not thought possible, that she had quietly and without fanfare become the center around which his world turned. The revelation had come to him gradually, accumulating in small moments he had tried to ignore. The way his chest tightened when he heard her laugh with the servants, the surge of protective fury when he overheard cruel gossip about her, the way returning to Ravenscross had begun to feel like coming home, rather than returning to a mausoleum of memories. The music swelled toward its conclusion, and Alistair made another decision that would be discussed in drawing rooms for weeks to come. As the final notes faded and the other dancers prepared to leave the floor for refreshments and gossip, he did not release Eleanor. Instead, he signaled to the orchestra leader with a slight inclination of his head, a wordless command that was instantly understood and obeyed. The musicians struck up another waltz, and Alistair kept Eleanor in his arms, claiming a second dance in succession in a breach of etiquette that was permissible only for engaged couples or newlyweds in the first blush of romance. It was a statement as clear as any words could be, that he was courting his own wife, that he intended to build the marriage they should have had from the beginning, that he was claiming not just Eleanor's position as his Duchess, but Eleanor herself as a woman worthy of being pursued and won. The gesture was both tender and possessive, a public declaration that what existed between them was not mere duty, but something far more personal and profound. Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest, some final barrier of self-protection crumbling under the sustained assault of his attention and care. She had taught herself not to want this, had convinced herself that she could be content with dignity and purpose, even without affection. But now that the possibility of more was being offered to her, she discovered that she wanted it desperately. She wanted the partnership they might build, the friendship that could grow between two people who had survived hardship and chosen each other anyway. She wanted the chance to know this complicated, damaged, surprisingly tender man who had hidden himself so thoroughly behind duty and grief. And yes, she wanted the physical intimacy that might come with emotional connection, wanted to be touched with desire rather than obligation, wanted to feel chosen rather than merely convenient. The wanting terrified her, because it made her vulnerable again after she had worked so hard to become invulnerable. But as they moved together in perfect synchronization, she found herself willing to take the risk. The second waltz became something almost sacred in its intimacy, despite being performed before an audience of hundreds. The other dancers had cleared the floor after Alistair's unprecedented request for a consecutive dance, leaving the Duke and Duchess alone in the center of the vast ballroom, moving together in a pool of candlelight that seemed to isolate them from the watching crowd. Eleanor became aware of details she had never allowed herself to notice before. The faint scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to his coat, the strength in his hands as he guided her through the turns, the way his grey eyes had softened from their usual granite hardness into something warmer, more vulnerable. She realized with a start that she had never truly looked at him before, had trained herself to see only the duke, the title, the position, rather than the man who inhabited those roles. Now freed by his own vulnerability to examine him more closely, she saw the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of tension and sleepless nights, the shadow of old grief that still lingered in his expression, the surprising gentleness with which he held her, as if she were something precious that might break if handled roughly. Alistair continued speaking to her as they danced, his voice a low murmur that created a private conversation within the public spectacle. He told her about the day he had realized he was falling in love with her, though he had not recognized it as such at the time. It had been an ordinary afternoon in early spring, and he had been working in his study when he heard her voice in the garden below, speaking with old Thomas about the placement of a new rose bed. She had been laughing at something the gardener said, a sound of pure, unguarded joy that had made Alistair look up from his correspondence despite himself. He had watched her kneeling in the dirt, her gown already stained beyond saving, her hands working the soil with a tenderness that had struck something deep in his chest. She had looked so alive, so present in the moment, so utterly different from the ghost he had been living as, and he had felt the first crack in the armor he had built around his heart. He had told himself it was merely appreciation for her dedication to his estate, that he was simply pleased to see Ravenscross being cared for properly, but he had found himself at that window increasingly often, watching for glimpses of her, feeling his breath catch when she smiled. The confession stunned Eleanor almost as much as his public declaration had. All those months she had believed herself unnoticed, invisible, failing in her most basic duty, and he had been watching her, seeing her, feeling his carefully constructed defenses eroding under the steady pressure of her simple presence. She thought of all the small gestures she had interpreted as indifference or dismissal, the book on roses left without comment, his rare appearances at dinner, the way his gaze seemed to follow her when he thought she was not looking, and suddenly they took on new meaning. They had been the tentative overtures of a man who had forgotten how to connect, who was trying to find his way back to humanity through the only means he knew: silent observation and small, anonymous kindnesses. She had missed every signal because she had been so convinced of her own unworthiness, so certain that he could see nothing in her worth valuing. They had been two people speaking different languages, reaching for each other across a chasm neither knew how to bridge, both convinced the other did not care. The realization made Eleanor bold in a way she had never been in his presence. She spoke for the first time since they had begun dancing, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. She told him that she had tried so hard to be worthy of him, to prove through her management of his estate and her care for his people that she deserved the position he had given her. She confessed that every night she had gone to bed believing she had failed, that she was not enough, that eventually he would realize his mistake in choosing her. She admitted that the lack of an heir had become an obsession that had poisoned her peace, that she had begun to see herself as nothing more than a vessel for producing the child that everyone demanded, forgetting that she had any other value. But his words tonight had shattered that terrible vision of herself, had shown her that she had been measuring her worth by the wrong standards entirely, that the things she had dismissed as inadequate, her kindness, her patience, her steady transformation of his household, were precisely what mattered most. Alistair's response was to pull her closer still, his hand tightening at her waist in a gesture that communicated what words perhaps could not. He told her that she had never needed to prove anything, that she had been worthy from the beginning, and he had simply been too blind and too wounded to see it. He acknowledged his failure as a husband, his cruelty in subjecting her to society's judgment without the protection of his public support, his cowardice in hiding from his feelings rather than confronting them honestly. He promised her, there in the middle of the ballroom with all of England's elite watching, that things would be different going forward. He would not hide anymore, would not retreat into silence and distance when life became difficult. He would learn to be the partner she deserved, would fight for her the way he should have been fighting all along. And if they were blessed with children, it would be a gift but not a requirement, because she had already given him something far more valuable. She had given him back his life, his capacity to feel, his ability to imagine a future that was not merely an endless repetition of duty and grief. The waltz finally drew to a close, and as the last notes faded into the ornate ceiling of the ballroom, Alistair did something that would be recounted in memoirs and letters for generations to come. He lifted Eleanor's gloved hand to his lips and kissed it with a reverence typically reserved for royalty, but he did not stop there. With deliberate slowness that communicated his intentions to every person watching, he turned her hand over and pressed a second kiss to the inside of her wrist, just above the edge of her glove, where her pulse beat visibly beneath the delicate skin. It was an intimate gesture, almost scandalous in its tenderness, and it sent a collective gasp through the assembled nobility. Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks, but she did not pull away, did not retreat behind the mask of ducal propriety she had worn for so long. Instead, she met his eyes and allowed him to see her response, the way her breath had quickened, the way hope and desire and cautious joy were warring for dominance in her expression. This was courtship, real and genuine, the thing their marriage had lacked from the beginning, and she found herself hungry for it in ways she had not allowed herself to acknowledge. The spell was broken by the approach of the Queen's representative, an elderly countess who served as Her Majesty's proxy at events the monarch could not personally attend. Lady Pemberton was a woman of considerable influence, whose approval or disapproval could make or break a social season, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety as the formidable woman approached. But the Countess surprised them both by offering a warm smile, rare from a woman known for her exacting standards and sharp tongue. She told Alistair that his declaration had been most affecting, that it spoke well of his character to value his wife so highly, and that Her Majesty would be most pleased to hear of such devotion between a duke and his Duchess. She then turned to Eleanor with an appraising look that seemed to truly see her for the first time, and remarked that the gardens at Ravenscross had been much discussed at court, that Eleanor's charitable works had not gone unnoticed in the highest circles, and that perhaps society had been too hasty in its judgments. The endorsement was clear and unmistakable, a social rehabilitation delivered with the weight of royal approval behind it, and Eleanor felt 3 years of accumulated tension begin to drain from her shoulders. What followed was a receiving line of sorts, as various members of the nobility who had previously snubbed Eleanor now approached to offer their congratulations and belated recognition. Some were sincere, genuinely moved by what they had witnessed and perhaps ashamed of their earlier complicity in her ostracism. Others were merely opportunistic, recognizing that the Duke's favor had been definitively bestowed and seeking to align themselves with power as they always did. Eleanor handled each with the grace she had perfected over years of navigating aristocratic society, but now there was a difference in her bearing. She no longer carried herself as a woman seeking approval, but as one who had been publicly claimed by the most powerful man in the room, and that shift in status was reflected in the deference she received. Alistair remained at her side throughout, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back, a constant physical reminder of his support and his presence. Lady Constance, who had orchestrated Eleanor's attempted humiliation, found herself increasingly isolated as the evening progressed. Those who had participated in her whisper campaigns now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with an attack on the Duke's chosen Duchess. The Visconde Edmund, reading the shift in power with the skill of a practiced courtier, approached the Duke and Eleanor to offer his congratulations with every appearance of sincerity, though Eleanor detected a tightness around his eyes that suggested disappointment at the loss of his inheritance prospects. Alistair received his cousin's congratulations with cool courtesy, making it clear without stating it explicitly that any future attempts to undermine Eleanor's position would be met with the full weight of ducal displeasure. The message was received and understood by everyone present. Eleanor was not merely the Duchess in title, but in fact protected and valued, and to move against her was to move against the Duke himself. As the evening wore on and the initial shock of the Duke's declaration gave way to more typical ball activities, Alistair leaned close to Eleanor and suggested they take their leave. He told her, loud enough for those nearby to hear, that he wished to show his Duchess the view from the terrace, that the moonlight on the gardens would be particularly fine this evening. It was a transparent excuse, of course, and everyone knew it, but it was also a statement of intent that sent knowing smiles through the crowd. The Duke of Ravenscross, known for his dedication to duty and his tendency to remain at social functions until the bitter end, was choosing to leave early with his wife, was choosing her company over obligation to society. Eleanor felt her heart hammer in her chest as she placed her hand on his offered arm and allowed him to lead her from the ballroom, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes following them, knowing that by tomorrow morning every drawing room in London would be discussing this extraordinary evening and its implications for the previously tragic marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscross. The terrace overlooked the restored gardens that Eleanor had poured so much of herself into over the past 3 years, and in the silvery moonlight they looked almost ethereal, like something from a dream rather than the product of countless hours of labor and patient care. Alistair led her to the stone balustrade, and they stood together in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the ballroom muted behind them, the night air cool against Eleanor's flushed cheeks. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way his hand had moved from her back to rest beside hers on the weathered stone, their fingers almost but not quite touching. The tension between them had transformed from the distant formality of their previous encounters into something charged with possibility, with the promise of intimacy, both emotional and physical. Eleanor found herself trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the overwhelming nature of everything that had happened, everything that had changed in the span of a single evening. Alistair broke the silence by speaking her name, just her name, but in a tone she had never heard from him before, tender, questioning, laden with an emotion that made her breath catch. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his, and told her that he meant everything he had said in the ballroom, but that he needed her to understand something crucial. He explained that he was not asking her to simply forgive and forget, to pretend that 3 years of loneliness and neglect had not happened. He acknowledged that trust, once broken, required time and consistent action to rebuild. What he was asking for was a chance, an opportunity to court her properly, to build the foundation of affection and partnership that should have existed from the beginning. He wanted to know her, the real Eleanor beneath the careful Duchess facade, wanted to share himself with her in return, wanted to create a marriage based on genuine connection rather than mere obligation. His vulnerability in that moment was absolute, a powerful man making himself defenseless before a woman he had wronged, offering himself up for judgment and hoping for mercy. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were different from the tears she had shed in the ballroom. These were tears of release, of years of pent-up longing finally finding expression, of grief for what they had lost, mixed with hope for what they might still build. She told him yes, that she wanted that chance too, that she had wanted it for 3 long years without daring to hope it might be possible. She confessed that she had begun to love him despite everything, despite his distance, and her better judgment had fallen for the glimpses of the man behind the title that he had inadvertently revealed. She admitted that the thought of losing him through annulment had been more devastating than the social humiliation, that somewhere in the midst of their broken marriage, she had developed feelings she had never expected to have. Her honesty matched his, a mutual vulnerability that felt like the true beginning of their relationship, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. What happened next was inevitable, natural, a culmination of the emotional intensity that had been building between them all evening. Alistair reached up to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears with a gentleness that made her heart ache. He asked permission with his eyes, waiting for her consent, and when she gave the smallest nod of agreement, he kissed her. It was nothing like the perfunctory kisses of duty that had characterized their physical relationship thus far. This kiss was tender and searching, an exploration rather than an obligation, and Eleanor felt it all the way to her toes. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart racing as wildly as her own, and she kissed him back with 3 years of suppressed longing. Time seemed to suspend itself as they stood together in the moonlight, 2 people finally finding each other after so long lost, and when they finally broke apart, both breathless, Eleanor saw her own wonder reflected in Alistair's eyes. They remained on the terrace long into the night, Talking with an openness they had never managed before, Alistair told her about his first marriage, about the young girl he had wed at 20, who had been sweet but fragile, who had died bringing his stillborn son into the world, leaving him shattered and convinced that love was simply too dangerous to risk again. Eleanor shared her own fears and insecurities, the weight of never feeling adequate, the shame of her body's failure to conceive when that seemed to be the only thing anyone valued about her. They spoke of their families, their childhoods, their hopes for the future, filling in the vast gaps of knowledge that should have been bridged years ago. And as they talked, Eleanor realized that this was what she had been missing, what no amount of physical intimacy or social position could replace, the simple, profound gift of being truly known by another person and accepted, valued, perhaps even loved for exactly who she was. The months that followed the summer ball became a period of transformation for both Alistair and Eleanor, a second beginning to a marriage that had started so coldly. True to his word, the Duke courted his own wife with a dedication that became legendary throughout society. He sent her flowers from the gardens she had restored, accompanied by notes in his own hand rather than dictated to a secretary. He arranged private dinners where they could talk without the formality of servants hovering, learning her preferences in food and wine and conversation. He read to her in the evenings from books they both enjoyed, their chairs drawn close by the fire in the library that had once been his exclusive domain. He walked with her through the estate, listening as she explained her plans and ideas, contributing his own thoughts, building a true partnership in the management of Ravenscross. And slowly, incrementally, the physical distance between them dissolved as well, replaced by a genuine intimacy that grew from affection rather than duty. The servants whispered about the Duke's transformation, about how the cold master had become a man who smiled, who laughed, who seemed to carry light within him, where before there had been only shadow. Eleanor bloomed under the attention like one of her carefully tended roses, shedding the layers of self-doubt and fear that had weighed her down for so long. She discovered that she had opinions she had been suppressing, desires she had not allowed herself to acknowledge, a sense of humor that had been buried under years of trying to be perfect and invisible. Alistair delighted in each new revelation, encouraging her to be fully herself rather than the careful construct of what she thought a duchess should be. They travelled together to the other Thornhill estates, and everywhere they went, Eleanor's reputation preceded her, not as the barren duchess, but as the woman who had transformed Ravenscross, who had captured the heart of the most powerful duke in England through nothing more than her own quiet excellence. Invitations flooded in, not from obligation but from genuine desire for their company, and Eleanor found herself at the centre of society rather than on its margins, valued now in ways that had nothing to do with her ability to produce an heir. And then, in the spring of their 4th year of marriage, Eleanor discovered she was with child. The news came as a shock to them both, a gift they had stopped expecting and had learned to live without. But the joy it brought was different now, tempered by the knowledge that their worth to each other did not depend on this child's existence. When Eleanor told Alistair, trembling with a mixture of happiness and fear that something might go wrong, he had held her close and told her that whether they had one child or 10 or none at all, she would always be his choice, his legacy, the person who had saved him from a half-life of grief and duty. The pregnancy was difficult, and there were moments when Eleanor's old fears resurfaced, when she wondered if her body would betray her as it seemed to have before. But Alistair remained steadfast beside her, his love unwavering, and in the winter of that year, Eleanor safely delivered a healthy son, an heir to the Ravenscross legacy, who would grow up knowing that his mother was valued for far more than her ability to produce him. The christening of young Thomas Alistair Thornhill, named for both his father and the old gardener, who had first recognized Eleanor's worth, became a celebration not just of birth, but of redemption and second chances. Lady Constance was notably absent from the guest list, her influence having waned considerably after her failed attempt to orchestrate Eleanor's downfall. The Visconde Edmund attended and was gracious in his congratulations, having made his peace with remaining a cousin rather than an heir. But it was the Queen herself who sent the most meaningful gift, a letter expressing her pleasure at the happy conclusion to a story that had moved all who heard it. and a personal note to Eleanor commending her for showing society that a woman's value resided in her character rather than her biology. The letter was framed and hung in the nursery, a reminder to young Thomas of the extraordinary woman who was his mother and the love story that had made his existence possible. Dear listener, perhaps you have found yourself in Eleanor's position, feeling overlooked, undervalued, convinced that your worth depends on meeting expectations that seem impossible to fulfill. Perhaps you have known what it is to be judged by a single measure, to have your entire existence reduced to one function or failure. Or perhaps you have been like Alistair, so damaged by past pain that you have built walls around your heart, convinced that distance equals safety, that if you never let anyone close, then you can never be hurt again. Eleanor and Alistair's story reminds us that our value is not determined by what we produce or achieve, but by who we are, by our kindness, our resilience, our capacity to transform the spaces we inhabit and the people we encounter. It teaches us that it is never too late for a new beginning, that broken things can be mended, that patience and grace can accomplish what force and demand never could. Most importantly, it shows us that being truly seen, truly valued for our authentic selves, rather than for the roles we play, is one of the most powerful forms of love we can experience. Eleanor was not vindicated because she finally produced an heir, but because someone finally recognized the worth she had possessed all along. And that, dear listener, is the kind of recognition we all deserve. Not for what we can give or produce, but simply for being exactly who we are. May you find the courage to value yourself even when others cannot see your worth. And may you encounter people who recognize your true value and reflect it back to you until you can see it for yourself. For in the end, we are all far more than any single expectation or failure. We are all, like Eleanor, deserving of being someone's choice, someone's legacy, someone's reason to believe in love again.